Thank you, thank you. It's always fun to be back in Toronto. I love coming out here. I appreciate Sean and his crew for bringing me out. It's always a lot of fun. Thank you. So we're going to talk about CSS a good bit, and we're going to focus on how to replace floats with Flexbox. So Flexbox is kind of the new thing coming around. So the first thing, we're going to solve the hardest problem ever in the world, and then we're going to go home. That's the plan. So this has been a problem for a very long time, right? And the problem, right, are you ready? Are you ready for the problem? The problem is centering something horizontally and vertically in HTML and CSS, right? Thank you, thank you. I know. We've been waiting years for this. This is the culmination of all the work that we've done over the past couple decades when it comes to HTML and CSS. And that's how you make it work. That's it. We're done. That's all we need. You have learned all you need to learn today. Let's go home. We're done. We're done. We're out. Go home. Go home. No, I'm just kidding. But seriously, Flexbox is changing how we do a lot of the layouts and the grid that we do on the web today. And before we kind of dig in, I'm going to give folks a really quick history of kind of how we got to where we are today with Flexbox, with layout, and with grid, so that you know. For the folks that haven't been doing this for 15, 20 years, it's changed a little bit. So in the very beginning, the culmination, like the best that we could hope for layout-wise, the most challenging thing was something that they called the Holy Grail, right? The Holy Grail of layouts, which was essentially, whoa. Fancy. Okay, so which was essentially a heading, a left column, a right column, some content there in the middle, and a footer. And that's what folks really try to do over and over and over again. It's kind of like the new Bootstrap layout that we see floating around, which is big header centered text, big column area with 3 buckets with an icon and some text, and then some other silly things that we've kind of grown into habits of doing. So a decade ago, we would do something, probably over the decade ago, maybe 15 years ago, we would do this with tables. So it was a table with a nested table, with a nested table, with a nested table, and those were the days, the simpler times of the web. Now, again, like the header, navigation, content, some type of secondary content, we call this an aside nowadays. They gave it a name, and then a footer. So some of the challenges with trying to do this with tables and then later on doing this with floats is that designers were involved. So I'm a designer myself, and I like things to look nice and be consistent. So when we moved from tables to floats, trying to make those 3 columns equal heights was a huge pain. Like we had background images or we had borders, and floats don't really work that way. Floats kind of collapse in on their content. So we did some really crazy, odd things to try and make that work. We did things like trying to give all of those containers like a really, really tall height, like thousands of pixels high, and then setting the parent to overflow hidden. And that's kind of how we did that. We'd use background images or background colors to repeat things like lines that didn't quite work. I'm telling you, if you didn't live that time, it was a very different world. And that's kind of what we did. Like it wasn't responsive. It was fluid, right? It would go to the width and like squish along with your browser size. So that's kind of how that kind of came about. Now, floats kind of do this, right? So they kind of collapsed on themselves. It was kind of hacky to make it work. They were dark times. So the second challenge is we kind of wanted the footer to stick to the bottom of the page. Like if there wasn't enough content, we didn't want this big gap. So a lot of JavaScript, a lot of crazy stuff to try and hack that to make it work. And yeah, all of that kind of brings us around to Flexbox and kind of the things that it's trying to solve, because it solves all those problems and it makes it so much easier to do. It's amazing. So let's go through a couple other examples that aren't specific to grid. One is something that you kind of see a lot in the past and even now. I think Nicole Sullivan called it kind of like the media object. Facebook uses it everywhere throughout their design. It's a common pattern that we see. Now, if we were doing this in the olden days, and even some now, is we would take that image and we would float it to the left. And the content would wrap around it, and it was great. But if the image was too long and the content wasn't long enough, the parent container would do something kind of like that. So it kind of collapses in on itself. Now, if you just so happen to float the image left and float the content right, you would get something kind of like that. So the container continues to decrease and decrease. So things like your padding for the one that follows isn't going to quite work as well. So that's an issue that we have when we're trying to float. And some ingenious folks came up with something they call the ClearFix. Before the ClearFix came about, we would just stick a div in there and put a style clear both on it and call it a day. Now, that was when the before and after pseudo selectors didn't quite work. So once those became a bit more common, then we would stick a div in there and put a class ClearFix on it that would still do the clear both. And then we changed the ClearFix, and the ClearFix was something that we put on the parent selector that essentially did something kind of like that. So we'd use a before and an after pseudo selector and dump in kind of a fake div that did kind of the same thing. And it did that to prevent the parent from collapsing in on itself when it had children inside that were floated to either side. So all those things bring us around to kind of why Flexbox is pretty nifty and solves a lot of those hacks that we've been doing for a couple decades on the web. So quick layout history for grid-specific stuff. Now, we say something like this quite often, right? It's a standard 12-column grid. Everybody uses these. Bootstrap uses that as well. And I kind of don't, I don't like those very much. The challenge that we've kind of gone into as we're creating a grid system is we create these really complex systems that can do everything, even though we really need like 10% of what it does. So it's plagued us with a whole bunch of classes, or classes upon classes upon classes that we use to lay things out. So we still build grids kind of the same way. Now, we did this by floating containers to the left or to the right, and with things like SAS or LESS or Stylus, it would do the calculations for us. Before, we had to kind of just do it manually, which was a sad time, but hey, you kind of had to do it. So the weird thing with that is a lot of the earlier grid systems would float things to the left, and then the last column they would float to the right to make sure that it took up the entire width of the container, right? Now, in some of the browsers, there was a rendering bug when you tried to do rendering off of a percentage with a whole bunch of decimal points. And what ended up happening is you would have, anybody can see what the problem is? Point it out. Yeah, that sucks, right? It drove me nuts for years because you would float everything to the left and you'd float it to the right, and all the widths are the same, but the browser's like, you can't have a half a pixel in a browser. So you ended up with a gap, and it was compounding for every grid. The more grids that you had, the larger the gap would get. Good times, very good times. So one of the things that Flexbox does when we're building a grid like this, it's a little bit smarter on how it calculates elements inside of the Flex container, right? So we're going to talk through all that stuff today. So who, out of curiosity, who has never used Flexbox before? Okay, a handful of folks. Who's like just kind of starting? Like you've looked at it, you know about it. Who's like been doing it for, I don't know, 6 months, maybe a year? I haven't. Like we're totally learning it together as a team, so we're moving that direction. So we're going to do kind of a primer, so you all understand how it works. It's so very different than how floats work. because it's not just a property that you stick on something and then you kind of hack around it to make it work. It's an entire series of properties that allow us to do and solve all the problems that we just talked about. So first things first. Okay, that's not as small as I thought it was going to be. So to make something a Flexbox container, you take the parent, and instead of saying display block or display inline block, you just say display flex, right? It's that simple. What that does is it tells all the children elements, direct children, inside of that parent container that they should behave like a flex container or a flex box, essentially, right? So assume we have a magical invisible container on our blue side, and then all the little white boxes is just a box. So you're going to notice that we're going to work a lot in our container because that's how Flexbox works. We'll get to the box, but don't feel too bad about it. We'll eventually get there, but there's not a lot to it on the box itself. So one of the first properties that we have in Flexbox is something called flex direction. Now, flex direction determines how the flex items, how our boxes are going to be laid out inside of its parent container. Now, it typically defaults to the top left corner and goes out. So flex direction, we have a handful of values that we can put on that. The first one in the default is row. So we're just telling the Flexbox container that any child elements inside, we want those to be displayed in a row. Nice and neat right after one another, right? Not too bad. We can also flip that and reverse the direction, which is kind of nice. So we can tell it that we want to take that row, and it essentially kind of mirrors that and just flips it over. So it goes 1 to 4 on the other side. Again, pretty easy, and it does that out of the box. We can also take that row and go, hey, you know what? I don't want a row. I want a column of stuff. So flip it the other way and have it go long ways. We can also reverse that column. It's good stuff. Not too bad. And if I'm going too fast, let me know. We'll post these slides afterwards. But it's like the properties themselves are pretty simple. But if you want to stop me and we can talk about it a bit more, totally down with that. Just like raise your hand or throw something at me. Cupcakes, root beer preferably. Okay, so as we kind of combine these things together, by default, let's say that we have 10 items inside of our Flex container, 10 boxes. What Flexbox is going to do is going to shove all of those 10 boxes together on a row. So the default setting is you set FlexWrap, right? It determines what if the boxes are going to wrap or not. It's going to say, nope, we don't want that to wrap at all. Just shove it all on one line, essentially. Let's see. So this is kind of the way that works. So the more items that we put inside of the Flexbox, the more boxes we stick in there, it's just going to keep squishing them together and squishing them together and automatically calculating the widths of those. If you don't want that to happen, you can tell it, you know what? I want you to squish until it makes sense not to, and then wrap the rest of the stuff. So the default setting is it just kind of thinks to it itself. You don't have to do a lot of calculations like nth child kind of stuff to make that work. It'll just figure out what makes the most sense and shove everything else on the next line. Now, it's still going to maintain that they're all the same width. So whatever it does, it's going to make sure that they all match width-wise, right? Width and height. So just like the other properties, we can reverse that. Pretty easy stuff. So it just takes those rows and flips them. So the bottom row is on top, top row is on bottom. Whatever's in the middle would flip with that as well. Okay, so shorthand. With all good CSS properties, there's shorthand, so we don't have to write all the properties by ourselves. So this is the shorthand for FlexDirect and FlexWrap. So by default, if you don't put anything in here and you just say display flex, that's what it's going to do kind of under the hood. It's going to say row, no wrap. So it's going to force all the child elements to be in a row, and it's going to force them to be on the same row. That's how it works. So if you want to override it, you have to rewrite the property, which is not a big deal. Okay, so in Flexbox, there are a couple of axes. There's one on the left, one on the right, one on the top, and you can move things around based off of that. So in this case, we're going to justify our content. So if you want to force it to be on the left-hand side, instead of doing like a float left or a text line left, we have justify content flex start. So Flexbox has this concept of a start and an end. So the start is on one side of the screen, the end is on the other side. So it's left and right, pretty much. So flex start is again the default value. If you don't put that in, it's what it's going to assume you want it to do. So it's going to shove everything to the left-hand side. Now if you want to put it to the right-hand side, we do flex end, right? So it's just saying go to the right. Take all of those boxes and shove them to the right. And you can also center. This is where the magic kind of comes in, where it does that stuff for us. So we can take all those boxes and we can justify content to the center. Pretty simple. Not too bad. Okay. Now this is where it kind of gets magical on handling those gutters when you're doing boxes or grids or anything like that. There's a property called space between. So space between, justify content, there's a value for that called space between. And what that does is it looks at the number of elements that you have, it tries to calculate their width, and it looks for any empty space that's going to be left over. And based off of that empty space, at the end of the calculation, it's going to give you gutters between each one of your boxes. But it's not going to take into account or give you a gutter on the far end, left or right, right? So it's going to butt the ends up against the edge, and then anything in between, it's going to normalize the spacing in between each of our boxes, right? Pretty cool. So no more of this crazy like widths, percentage widths and margins or negative margins, just crazy stuff that we're trying to do in grid systems right now. It'll do that for us, which is pretty darn nice. There's a secondary option to that is a value that you call space around. So it does kind of the same thing, but it takes all the boxes and it does an equal space between each one of them. So on the left and right side and in between. So that's what it does, right? Pretty good. Okay, a little bit more magic. So after we kind of do all of that stuff, some of the challenges that we saw with the three-column layout is doing things like equal columns. So one of the things that it allows us to do is it allows us to call a property called flex items. And in flex items, we can set that to stretch. And that's going to just stretch everything out as tall or wide as it can go. So it'll go the full height, the full width of whatever Flexbox thinks that it should take up, right? Now, that's kind of how it works. So another thing that we can do with flex items is we can do flex start. So kind of the same thing. It's going to bump that up against the top of the screen. Or we can do flex end, and it's going to do it at the bottom. So you almost kind of get kind of a Flexboxy version of positioning, where you can position a group of boxes to the top, left, right, or bottom of the viewport, or its parent container. It's pretty good, pretty darn good. I really like this stuff. Or we can center those, right? The magical vertically aligning something inside of its parent container, which has been the hardest thing to do ever. That's kind of how you do that. So you do flex item center, and that's going to make it vertically align inside of its parent. Similar to how it does our stretch, we can do our stretch here, and it'll stretch things long ways. And it's going to fill in all of our gaps. So if we have a number of boxes, it's going to fill in any empty space, right? So just like we're distributing those gutters horizontally, using stretch, or the align content stretch property distributes those gutters vertically as well. So you can do really funky stuff with cards and odds and ends. So you can also take that large quantity of boxes, and again, you can align the content to flex start. You can do it to flex end. So again, we're going to the top, bottom, left, or right. or we can center all those. Right? It's pretty good. Just like the other property, we can use space between. It'll do the exact same thing, right? So it's normalizing the space in between each one of those rows and evening it out for us. You can also do space around. It does the same thing, right? So it's going to do spaces top, bottom, and in between. All right, so that's the parent. One of the things that you'll notice in Flexbox is that most of the manipulation on the child elements happen from the parent. It took me a while to wrap my head around that because I'm so used to manipulating the actual element that I'm working with. Flexbox doesn't really conform to that, which is kind of nice. It means you write much less code, and it's a little bit easier to maintain. Like once you wrap your head around that you're manipulating the children through properties on the parent, it makes a lot more sense. Now, all that said, there are a few things that you can do to have a bit more granular control around how those children are laying out, and we're going to dig into those a little bit. So there are child properties that we can also use to give us more fine-tuned control on those child elements. So this is nasty CSS. You probably shouldn't copy that if you can help it. This is just for the purpose of the example. So one of the things that we can do, which is something we tried to hack when responsive first came out, and that is changing the order of the elements, right? So we have the DOM order, the order that things show up in our source code, and sometimes in responsive, we don't want it to follow the same order. Some content, depending on how it reflows, we want that to have a higher priority or to deprioritize. So that's what order gives us. And these happen specifically on the child elements. So we have 5 boxes, and it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now what we've done is we've taken the very first one, and we're saying we want that to be -1. Oops, sorry, the second one. We want to move 2 to 1, and then we want to take the third one and move that around, and everything else just needs to be the order of 0. So it's almost kind of like z-index, essentially, like you're just moving things around a bit. So in this case, it's 2, 1, 4, 5, 3. And you can adjust it in responsive context, moving things up or down, whatever makes sense to what you're doing. So order is pretty darn nifty. Okay, a few other things around fine-tuning the width of a specific child element, a specific box. We have 3 things that we can use to have better control over how those expand or contract. The first one of those is something called FlexGrow. Now, these are still kind of weird to me because I'm used to, like, I want it to be a percentage and I want it to stay that percentage, or I want it to be a pixel width and stay that width. These are factors of growth. So you're not defining a specific width for these. You're defining a factor that's going to increase or decrease based off of the other children, or the other siblings, I guess, the other sibling boxes that exist along with it inside the parent container. So what it's going to do is it's going to look at the other children, and it's going to grow based off a factor of 1. So it could increase the size by whatever that factor is you define, and it's going to be relative to the number of children inside of that parent container. So it's kind of weird, and it helps to just dump this on CodePen, just like play around with it for a bit. It makes a lot more sense after you do that. So this is kind of what that would do. I lied. That's what that will do. There we go. So what we're going to do, we're going to target the third child, and we're going to have it grow by twice the size of its siblings. So in this case, there's going to be 5. We're going to take 3 and essentially double the size. So Flexbox, again, is going to kind of do its own math. It's going to say, all right, there are 5 children inside our Flex container, and here's the widths that I think they're going to be. So the third one, I'm going to double that size. But I'm also going to take into account the gutters that I've already calculated as well. So Flexbox will do that on the fly. So that's FlexGrow. So it's going to grow based off of a factor of, in this case, 2. All right. Flex basis is another one. Now, flex basis is more kind of, I guess, what I'm accustomed to, where you give it a percentage or a width, a pixel width, and it works essentially the same way. So I can say the flex basis, I want that third box to be 200 pixels wide. And Flexbox is going to go, all right, third box, you're 200 pixels wide, and then it's going to recalculate the widths of the other 2 boxes, or the other 4 boxes, right? So we have some, there's a flex, skipped it somewhere. Shrink, there it is. So we have a shrink, it does kind of the same thing. So you kind of, you can use shrink and grow in tandem. And what those allow you to do is define the scale in which an element can shrink or grow. So you're kind of giving it min and maxes. So that's kind of how those work. And now that makes more sense. So there's also a shorthand for those. So you can just use flex. So flex is grow, FlexGrow, flex shrink, or flex basis. So you can do the shorthand there and give it a min max or give it a basis to go off of. All that pretty clear? All right. Okay, that's the primer. Like that's really all there is to the Flexbox spec. But making things with it is a little bit dicey. So it takes some getting used to because it's so different than what we've been doing in the past. So some of the best things to do if you're wanting to dig in and kind of play around, some folks have been pretty ingenious and have kind of gamified learning how to use Flexbox. So there's Flexbox Frogging, which is pretty awesome. So it walks you through everything that we just talked about, lets you practice how they work, and you can kind of see in real time how those properties affect the frogs on their lily pads. So essentially what it's having you do is position the frog on its lily pad, and you go to the next stage. Right, cute, right? The next one is Flexbox in 5. Kind of the same deal. It runs you through all the properties, lets you practice, and I guess they're promising that they're going to teach you everything in 5 minutes, which is not too bad. But it gives you a lot of things that you can use to kind of, instead of having to write the markup yourself, you can dump in a child element and manipulate that on the right-hand side in the control panel. And then it gives you examples of the code, so you can see what it's actually spitting out from a CSS perspective. That one's kind of like a next step, I think, in that you're working with real CSS and you can build things a bit more real world. That one I found very useful, just trying to figure out specific around shrink and grow and how those work, because it's still kind of weird. Okay, so let's talk about grid systems and kind of how those would work in Flexbox. So there's a bit too much of these types of systems going on, and I mentioned earlier that like we spend all this time making this really complex grid system, or we download Bootstrap because we only really want the grid system, but then we only really want like 10% of it, and it's hard to kind of separate that stuff out. So I'm not going to walk you through how to build like another Bootstrap. That's been done so many times. Other folks have done a much better job of kind of how that works. So if you want to look at Flexbox specific code on building a Bootstrap-like grid system, there's flexboxgrid.com that has their own little framework, and it follows a lot of the ways that Bootstrap does theirs. It's just all Flexbox. Bootstrap as well has a Flexbox version of the grid system. It's pretty nice if that's something that you want to use. There's also a Flexbox grid system that kind of got inventive, and they're using data attributes instead of classes, which I kind of think's nifty. So you do a ratio essentially in a fraction, and that's how you determine that inside of a data attribute. It's pretty cool. Okay, so we're going to walk through a handful of grid examples and just kind of play with Flexbox a bit and show you how you might make some more real-worldly type work. So here's some HTML, and what we essentially have is assume this is like a full-page marketing site, and you just want something to be full screen, split into 2 panes. You're going to have an icon, some heading, some text, maybe call to action somewhere. You're going to have that on both sides. So the HTML that I would write for this would be something kind of like this. So I'm using the plural singular naming convention. So I have panes, and then I have a pane. Inside each pane, I have an image, a title, and some content, and that's just the same for both of the panes, right? So what I want to do is take this, essentially the body of my HTML, and I have my panes. I want to split those in two, and I want it to always maintain full width and full height of the browser window. So whenever I resize, I want all the stuff in the middle to stay centered, right? So that's what we're going to do. Here's kind of how it would work. So the first thing is we're going to focus on the pane itself, or the panes container. So the way that we make this work, and to note, I'm not using any vendor prefixes because that would just be crazy trying to put that on here. So don't try and copy and paste this and assume it's going to work in every browser. It'll work in like CodePen and if you're using the most modern browsers. Some of the IE browsers still need a little bit of love. But you can dump it in CodePen and it'll work. Just make sure you turned on vendor prefixes or auto prefixing just in case. And that'll give you all the good stuff that you need. So we have our panes. So again, to make any container a Flexbox container, we just set it to display flex, right? And that's going to tell all of its child elements that we want them to behave like a Flexbox box. In this case, we're setting our flex direction. So we want our flex direction to be a row. So we want column A, column B to be together. We don't want them to wrap at all. Again, those are the defaults, but just so y'all can see kind of what we're doing, we're going to explicitly declare those. And for our container, we want to justify the content to the center. Now, VH isn't a Flexbox property. That's just a nice little simple cheat to take into account the viewport height. So it's going to make sure that the height of our Flexbox is always going to be the height of the viewport. So whenever you drag that sucker around, drag the browser button, it's going to always take up the full height. And then we're just going to align all the text to the center and make sure the width is 100%. So only a few Flexboxy things there that we really need to use. So now we can focus on the panes themselves. So the panes, because they also have content, we want to behave like a Flexbox, essentially, because we want to center those vertically. Now we're also going to set the pane to display flex. And in this case, because flex causes all the child elements to show up in a row and shove them together in their parent, we're explicitly stating that we want the direction to be a column. So we don't want our icon and our heading and our paragraph to be in one row. We want them to be one after the other, right? So we're stating that there. We're justify the content to the center so that it always sits in the middle vertically. And that's essentially it. That's all you really have to do to make that work in Flexbox, which is so much simpler than trying to write a bunch of JavaScript to figure out the browser height is this high, and I want the pane to always match that height, and then I have all this content inside, so it's this far from the top, so position it that way and adjust that whenever I resize the browser, which is such a pain. Totally doable, but now we can do it with just CSS. So that's example one. Simple two-pane, centered content. That's it. Okay, let's go back to the Holy Grail of layouts. And if I was writing that, this is kind of what I would write. So I have a header. I'm going to call that my masthead. It's sitting up there at the top. I have a main container that's going to hold my article, which is the stuff in the center, my navigation, which is the left-hand side, and my sidebar, which I have on the right. And then I have my footer down below. So pretty simple markup-wise, not too much to it. Now, one thing to point out is source order. I'm not following the visual order that I have. I have my header first and then my content. So even though my content's in the middle, source order-wise, it's first in that list. There's a reason for that, and I'll talk about that in a bit. And then we have the navigation sidebar stuff kind of after that because it's really secondary to the content. The content is the most important part, which is why it's kind of up there. Now, CSS, a few things to make this work so that our footer sits at the bottom. we're going to set a height 100% on our HTML on our body. And I kind of have to do that, otherwise it kind of compresses down. It's kind of weird. And then again, just like everything else, we're going to take our body and we're going to set our body to display flex. So all the child elements are going to now become Flexbox compatible. And what we don't want it to do, we don't want to have our header and our main and our footer all set up in a row. So we're going to set that to flex direction column. So our header goes full width, and our main goes full width, and our body goes full width. So essentially we're working with two different flex displays, right? The first one is the body. The second is this intersection. So we have our container, right? This is our main container that houses our aside, our content, and our navigation. So the only thing we need to do there is set that to display flex, and we're setting flex to 1. So what flex is going to do is going to normalize the widths of the children. Now they're not equalized there because there's some magic later on that's going to come, but that forces them to go full width, right? So it's going to normalize all that good stuff. So now what I can do is I can focus a little bit on the content inside of my container, right? So I'm going to focus on my article or my content right now, which is there. So what I want to do with the content is I want that to flex to 1 because I want that to be the squishy portion of it, right? I want to take up whatever empty space is left and just take it all up. On my navigation, I'm using flex basis because it makes sense in my brain. You could totally use like a normal flex and adjust that scaling ratio to make it work, but I want a little bit more control over how wide that's going to be and not have it be a ratio based off of the other children. So I'm setting my basis 30%. So it's going to be 30% essentially over there. Now you notice the order. So in my source order, the navigation should show up after my content. In this case, I want it to show up before. So I'm going to set that to -1, so it bumps it to the beginning. So visually, it's where I want it to be. The sidebar, I'm going to use flex basis again and just set that to 20%. So what that's going to do is give us a nice layout like that, right? So now I have the Holy Grail in Flexbox, and that's really all it took. And it'll size down and reflow as I want it to. If I want to do responsive stuff, I can dump in some media queries and change how those lay out. And it's not a big deal. It's pretty nice. So that's it. That's the Holy Grail in Flexbox. Now, something a bit more modern, I guess, is if we're building an application, maybe like an email application that has a couple sidebars on the left-hand side. Markup-wise, I don't really have to change too much. Now, I might want to adjust some of the classes so they make a bit more sense based off the context. But the only thing I'm doing is changing my order. So I've taken the navigation, I bumped that to -2, so it stays on the far left-hand side, and I've taken the sidebar, I bumped it to -1. That way there's my navigation, my sidebar, and then my content. So a couple of really quick changes, and I have a different layout. A little bit easier than messing around with floats and adjusting classes in my HTML to make that work. It's just all my CSS, and it's just a couple of properties that I add on. Okay, so something a little bit more fun. So this is a card layout that you'll see often. It could be images, it could be something like this that has an image and some text. Now, if we did this in floats, now we're lucky here because everything's exactly the same, but if we did this in floats and floated everything to the left and gave it some margins or tried to use a grid system, we would get something kind of sort of like this. Now, markup-wise, again, I'm using the kind of a similar naming convention in that I have singular cards, plural cards, singular card. So I just have numerous cards inside. I can add as many of those that I want, and it's going to do its thing. Now, what I want that to do is design-wise, I want that to be a bit more normalized on how it lays things out and be smarter, because I want, no matter how many cards I have inside that parent, I want them always to take up the full width of the parent, and I want it to readjust the cards as Flexbox sees fit. I don't really care what it does as long as it takes up the width of that entire container, right? Width and height. I just want to see cards, all cards everywhere. So what I can do is something kind of like that. So I take my cards container, and I just tell that display flex. Now I'm going to use my shorthand for flex flow, and I want it to be set as a row. So I want it to be set as a row, and I want it to wrap. Like whatever makes sense, Flexbox, just wrap my stuff. And then I'm also using shorthand for the card to give those a width. So in this case, I want at least 4 cards per row, like a max of 4 cards per row. But then what I wanted to do, and what you see kind of on the last portion of that, is I'm using a couple of nth child selectors. So whether it's the last child or a multiple of 4, I wanted to readjust that to 33% as the min width. Min width's important because it's not always going to be 33%. Well, it kind of is, but it's going to be in relation to the other boxes. So what happens is if I take away or remove boxes and it's a little bit beyond that, it'll reflow to that, right? So that little bitty bit of CSS allows me to add as many or as few boxes as I want. And it's going to normalize the sizing to have it make sense, which I think is pretty darn magical. Because normally if you did this in CSS, you would have to do some crazy stuff with media queries and with inchild and overriding inchild to try and make that work. This makes me pretty giddy. That's where the last child comes from. Just in case there's only one on the end, it's going to make that go full width, right? And that's it. So that's like a really funky thing you can do with a card type layout or images. And it's so little CSS. It just kind of blows my mind a little bit. Okay, so design patterns. That was going to kind of become part of this talk, but I'm also talking again at the end of the day. And this talk was already going kind of long. So we're going to talk about nothing but responsive design patterns with Flexbox for about 45 minutes at the end of the day. So don't miss it. It'll be fun. We'll go into a handful of examples. So a couple important things to note. One is accessibility. Because we're all developers, right? It should be in the forefront of our mind. It's important. It gets kind of weird with Flexbox, specifically around the reordering portions of this. So we have our funky layout, right? Where DOM order, we have header, article, nav aside, but that's not what we see visually, right? We adjusted that. So the challenge with DOM order is that we have DOM order, we have the visual order that we see, right? So visually, here's what I see, but it doesn't match what I'm really adjusting. And then we have the tab order. So if I'm using my keyboard to tab through content, it's going to follow the DOM order, and it's not going to follow the visual order. So any ordering that I do in Flexbox, it's going to kind of wreak havoc on folks using a keyboard. And it's also going to cause some trouble if they're using a screen reader because it's going to read the content in the order that it sees in the DOM, which is a little bit of a sad violin. Like it's not the best. So the working group is I'm not sure how far along they are on it. Maybe they've already solved it. But they're trying to figure out a way to kind of make that work and be friendly to folks using a screen reader or have some type of disability. Yes. So that's the only weird accessibility nugget that I've been able to find with accessibility. And it's an odd one. Okay, browser support. So the important thing, what can you use now and what shouldn't you use? So full support, right? So Chrome, Safari, Firefox, Opera, Opera's in there twice, IE Edge 12 and up, they support like all the newest stuff in Flexbox, right? Pretty good stuff. All the things that we did today, they're supported in all the browsers. It's pretty phenomenal. Now, I work at a consultancy, and we're finding that a lot of our newer projects are IE 10 and up. It's not too bad, right? So we were trying to do a lot more stuff in Flexbox. We have some projects that don't use IE at all, which makes me really happy because we can do so many magical things without worrying about things that might not be compatible or trying to do fixes in the floating sense. So there is posture support in IE 10 and 11. There is no support in IE 9 and below. So if you really want to use Flexbox on your project and all you have to support are the modern browsers, you're in luck because it all works. If you still have an IE 10 or 11 support, you will need some massaging to make that work. Some of the features aren't supported. Some of them are supported, but on the older prefixes, vendor prefixes. So keep that in mind. And if you have to support IE9, I probably wouldn't even worry with Flexbox because you're essentially writing everything twice and maintaining everything twice to make that work. One of them is very awesome. One of them is like what you're accustomed to now. So it might not be a big deal. If you want to do that, you could, but you don't have to. So that's Flexbox. So there are time for questions, I think.
20 seconds.
Oh, one quick question.
Can we get the notes for that?
No, I'm kidding, totally kidding. I'll give this to Alfred, and he'll stick them online with all the code. There'll eventually be code pins for all of these to make it easier.
Yeah, with that last row, is there a way to make it so that there's like a minimum number on the last row so you don't get this like last one that's filling the full width?
Yeah, so the last row you can do a couple things. If like the full width is kind of weird, you can set it to have a width, but then justify that so it's centered, as opposed to just it being stuck over there. So you can totally do that. All right, I think we're done.
Awesome. Yeah, and Bermon will